where I was going is that I was just trying to put forward that I think that it is our prerogative as human beings. Um, the author Arthur Avalon said that I think the word man is of a Sanskrit. Is of what's called Sanskrit, which is an ancient word language from India. A lot of our English itself, I sometimes don't think that English is a language because one is that I think that if any language has truly vulgar, um, wicked terms and names that are a part of what that language is, I think that it's compromised in that way, and that it's no longer a language at that point. If there actually are wicked, profane terms and words in it, I don't think that it's a language anymore. And I know that could be debated because I think that different languages across time, across what's called time and space, have had like derogatory words. They have had. I think there's a word called diminutive. So I think like sometimes when you say like teeny, eeny, beeny, litsy, little, that nee, the e part, it conveys smallness, and I think that can be endearing. But it can also be affronting and disrespectful. Like if you were to call someone poopy or something like that, like or like boo boo or poopy or something like that, that's a diminutive. I think like it's like it conveys smallness and immaturity, and that could be like one an endearing way. There was a cool person I went to school with, and I think their name was like Cooey, and that had been from their grand. They were one of the coolest people of my whole education in school. Like some people are just simply cool, and they've never been anything but cool, and they're not trying to be. They're just cool people. And I didn't know that person well, but that person was like that. And I don't mean to be dropping people's names because I don't know them. I never had anything to deal with them, but that had been their name, Cooey. And then I found out that that was like their grandmother had named them that because they made that sound when they were a baby. But I think that's a diminutive term where you're ascribing littleness and also neoteny, which is like babiness or like youngness, um, uh, in an endearing way to a person as their a fixed title and name, and that's beautiful and profound, and that's a deep part of African American culture and other cultures. But that can at times it can also be derogatory and disrespectful. Like if someone were to call someone like boo boo or like poopy boo or something like that, where it's diminutive and it's also it's conveying a little bit of neoteny because those are the terms that you would use around the defecating of a small, very small children. But it can be derogatory like that. And then obviously there's higher degrees of that. So I'm not going to say there's any human language that hasn't contained profanity, vulgar words, or different things suitable for mocking a person. Those would be mocking a person. If you call someone like boo boo or poopy, that's mocking them because you're using something about their likeness or essence ostensibly to deride and insult and reframe the concept of that person to themselves and to others. So you're mocking a person, and it's one of the most that attempt when something comes to the point of mocking, you have a real red flag on your hands, and that can attend and lead up to any other heinous form of violence possible. Not the least of which genocide, because when people had been genocided, as us African Americans are being currently in the United States, over and around entertainment broadly and hip hop, but then just culture deeper than that, and the histories and brutalities of the United States. At present is egregious and is very thick, and the broader part of that and what facilitates that is assaulting the image of black males, and I think that the place where I come from in Africa, our people, one of my people, my father's of a dual African heritage. One of our people, and then other people in the region we're from who have a similar history as our people, suffered an actual order for genocide by the near ancestors, and some of I would say you might have a few living members of the actual officers and leadership that gave the 20th century some of the most famous and egregious formal organized genocides around World War II. What happened in World War II had happened before at the beginning of the 19th century in Southwest Africa by the ancestors, the near ancestors of the same proponents of the genocide in World War II, and that's a lesser known history. But the only reason I bring that up is because the survivors of, and I actually went to a gathering in New York City where some ranking members of the culture that I come from were collaborating with European ancestors of one of the genocides of World War II, and at that level, those type of people, if you can imagine the type of people I would meet there, both African and European who I met there, some of which I was related, even my own family is of that type of rank and stature and background to speak intelligently in that type of venue. There had been a gathering in New York City, like I think it's around like 2016, in the early summer, spring, and these European survivors were there, and it was so deep. I talked to this woman there, an elderly European woman, and she was off into her late 80s and 90s, like in 2016, and she said that she had been like I think she was something happened where she was like in some type of camp in she was in a camp in near around Germany in what's called the Holocaust. And I don't mean to say that arbitrarily. I just simply don't know how people feel about the term Holocaust. I don't know if people would appreciate that term or not. When I was in the Southwest, I loved and knew many beautiful people of Mexican and Mexican American background, and also Chicano. I think Chicano is like Mexican American, so Mexican and Chicano and Native American and African American and Anglo American background, and all that can run together and is beautiful and is part of the culture. But some of them don't appreciate the term Hispanic, and I ran across that as a child, not knowing, not being none the wiser. So I also want to be careful on the word Holocaust because I don't know how people feel about that, but I know that that's a real and beautiful and brutal history. But I just want to be respectful because I don't know how people feel about that term. But this woman was there around Germany during that, and somehow there was a serviceman. I think I'm not sure if this is at the time of liberation or somehow, but somehow there had been a service member in Germany or where she was. I think it may have been an outline. It wasn't Germany proper. It was an outlying area as Allied forces were advancing on Germany. But these people subjected to this genocide, they were in as precarious and dangerous of a situation at that point, even as near about as there may have been close to a resolution of that conflict, as that's appreciated. I know that might be again arbitrary to say that was resolved, but just that as some of the most brutal aspects of the internment camps were being liberated and resolved, they were still yet in grave danger at the outlying range, and then I think closer deep in Germany with my limited understanding of history. But somehow this woman who I met in 2016 had been a young girl and child in these camps. That was part of her childhood, and there was an American service member there. And somehow it was figured out between that service member and this girl that service member was from an area, a borough of New York City, that this young girl, or if not herself, her family that was a little bit older, they were aware of one of their relatives who lived in the very borough, the very neighborhood where this American service member was. And somehow this service member and these people were able to figure out that connection, and it amounted to this girl getting to her family in New York City safely out of that situation. I think that camp was liberated, but those people were still at the edge of at a critical extended position and within poverty, because just because the camps were liberated, I don't think that necessarily meant that they got all the support that they needed right then and there. But I'm going off of the track of history right there because I can't back that up with sources. But all I know is that somehow this person that I met in New York City was blessed with some type of connection between a U.S. service member that she met, and then his neighborhood of descent, and then her family that actually lived in that neighborhood. And it amounted to her getting to safety and resource and support to live healthy and stable thereafter. And I actually met that type of person when I was there in 2016. Just to show you that I'm not making this stuff up. But that history that shared history between the people that I come from in Africa and these European people that experienced a similar intent to make an attempt at genocide. What's significant in all that, and the only reason I bring that up, is the image of a people, because those survivors of the Holocaust, they understand to this day that when you start to make statements, I think the term would be anti-Semitic. When you start to make statements that are anti-Semitic, and that takes traction, it might first of all, it's distasteful in the first place to disrespect a person on the lines of heritage and ethnicity equally, but you do that and you get away with a statement here and there, and then that catches on. That first insult that had been communicated and that was stomached and tolerated, it can, like a snowball, it can amount to an entire nation, you take how some of the very people who so I've talked about how distasteful I think psychotherapy is and pandering is, that it comes from. I'm not saying it's not effective, but I'm just saying it's distasteful. And some of the very proponents of psychotherapy, they are associated with mass media, and also getting America to a war fever in World War One, where America wasn't necessarily inclined that way at that point, is my understanding. A part of that was facilitated by mass media and near relatives, uh, uh, um, influencers, advertisers, manipulators that were near cognates of some of the staunch originators of the field of psychotherapy, where even I think the original the original figureheads of psychotherapy, I think some of that might have been borrowed from subtler techniques of more obscure people, people dealing with like hypnotism and stuff like that. I picked that up in a few books, but no less, they were the original proponents. They were familiar with techniques that are effective in manipulating a person's experience of their own self-concept and how that would affect their interaction with other people and their circumstance and their experience of themselves. Again, they were yet familiar with techniques that can be achieved. Maybe you could just say that's a different level of manipulating our human instincts, where we are malleable as human beings and our instincts are to a different degree. Training would be like an example when our instincts are being overlaid and formed to serve a purpose, a man-made purpose, agreed upon purpose, and intentional purpose. And I'm not saying that's not effective, but it can also be done in another way, where it can either be done in a disingenuous way as a detriment, or just simply to make a person what you want them to be, to fix them. The word fix is synonymous with changing a person and also neutering a person. And you somewhat neuter a person when you change them according to your own standards, for better or worse according to your own standards. When you change a person from being who they are to be, who they choose to be, you are affronting something of their actual potence and essence and ability to be creative. That is, ability to associate as a prerogative, and with joy de vivre, with esteem, with enthusiasm, with passion, with originality, as you attempt to change someone for better or worse. And that's what's so distasteful about the psychotherapy movement, in my view, and in my taste. But then some of their near cognates and relatives, by the point of, because that was happening in the mid to late 1800s, as I understand. But then in the early 20th century, the second half of the second decade of the 20th century, at least, some of these cognates, but also benefactors of those techniques, were applying that in Hollywood and mass media, and is able to get an entire nation to go to war, to go to trench warfare, to go to some of the brutality, whatever the worst experiences that have been undergone by human beings. I'm not saying when that started or that has ever stopped, but as much of the worst of it has gone on during that point of World War One, and what got America over there had been these manipulative people affecting people's image of people. So I would say they somehow affected Americans' image of themselves and of the war in Europe enough to get them to go along, to be dragged along to Europe for that theater. And I'm not saying that the consequence of World War One was good or bad, but I'm just saying that what amounted to getting America on board, having not originally been on board, was a function of mass media, propaganda, both, I think, labor propaganda, because you also had some labor people there, and you had like there's like there's a lot of strikes around labor that had to do with that time. There were different thoughts about anarchy about that time, And there were different thoughts about pacifism about that time. And I don't know that any of that is different, but I know that it was impacted by propaganda. All that was impacted by propaganda effectively and profoundly. Not the least of which Hollywood, but not limited to Hollywood. And that's also an offshoot of the history of psychotherapy. But then you take that further in that, and there's also something, and those are people from the same region of Europe, both the proponents of psychotherapy and the proponents of propaganda and the proponents of the genocide attempt in official order that came down on some of the people I come from and some of the people of the European genocide of World War II era, prior to and during World War II, and then and then again the second genocide in the genocide in the World War II period that had been initiated, and then maybe sustained by equally a propaganda campaign. I don't know how much propaganda was or was not attendant of the atrocity that the people I come from suffered in Southwest Africa, but I would imagine it had a good deal to do with propaganda, what had led up to that, and that what's more so deeper is that. So I just want to point out how significant it is to mock any one person. Is that when you change before you can, it's difficult for a human being to be violent to another human being on a fundamental level, because I think again we actually are one another at essence, and that's what when you come. They say that violence is one of the intimate things, even as intimate, if not more intimate, than lovemaking. And as you get that intimate with the person, you see the similarity between you, and you actually can see that you are one another. And that might be the coldest thing about what is a killer. Everybody loves killers and can't get enough of killers. But what is so deep about killers is that they are willing to hurt themselves. They are willing to hurt another human being who is not different than themselves, to the point of confiscating and breaching their opportunity to exist within the cycles to exist and opportunities to exist that have been afforded to them. That is cold and brutal, and that is self-harm, and that is the most deadly thing. You see someone with all these crazy tattoos, what's so scary about that? Because they were able to hurt themselves that much to put those tattoos. They were able to deprive themselves of social status to that much by putting those tattoos. Therefore, they can do the same to anyone else, and therefore they have the potential to be dangerous. If you can do that to yourself, you can do that to another person. That's what's conveyed in a tattoo, and that's also a lot of. And I'm not saying tattoos are good or bad either, but I'm just saying that that's an example of how killing. When you have tattoos like that, you look like a killer. What is killer about killing is to kill another person who is you. That's what killing is. And so, but to do that, you have to somehow you have to mitigate the fact that you act the reciprocity, the similarity, the consonance, the harmony between existence between you and another. You have to overcome that somehow. Whether you do that with cognitive dissonance, by being dishonest with yourself, by rationalization, which is also cognitive dissonance, by making idealism or something that you can that you need some form of some form of authority or permission to hurt yourself and another person on the deepest levels, and that's cognitive dissonance, rationalization, and also mocking to fix and change the image of another person, the idea of another person, to less than human. That allows you to brutalize them as though they were not human, though they yet are human, and you appreciate that the whole time on some level. But to get enough cognitive dissonance to engage in that degree of violence, you need some form of dehumanization, which can be justification, rationalization. Maybe you could say greed, which is again rationalization, but then also mocking. So you see someone mock anyone for anything, and it's as potent as though they were genociding an entire group of people, because it's just at one degree of that seed. So I've said that you see like small cubs, like cat cubs, like lions, and they're like, or tigers, and they're harassing a small turtle, and it looks like the cutest thing. Those are the very same instincts that will amount to them slaking the throat of a larger animal in front in outstanding, brilliant, poignant fashion in front of their friends, loved ones, if not offspring, to die a most heinous, brutal, and agonizing death, choking on their own blood. That instinct of the larger cat doing that is not different than the instinct of the smaller cat doing that. It's just at a different phase. And you can say it's cute, and you can say it's not when they do it as a child or as a cub. and you can say it's beautiful and it's vital, and it's not when it's done as at the larger scope, but it had yet been nature like that. But that's how potent it is when we're mocking anyone about anything. So you see that, and I think that's a lot of why the European survivors of that episode are they're careful not to tolerate any form of mocking them as a group, because it is that potent, and history can repeat itself the same way as it always has with anyone with anything. And but us currently as U.S. Black males, and maybe also black males broader, likely also black males broader, we have our very image assaulted and mocked by one another and by others and by both together. That is as egregious as what has happened in other points of genocide, and we now have the numbers and the horror stories to go with and attend any other level of brutality. You say, well, they're not rounding up black men and women in the streets and taking them off somewhere, but they don't have to. The way, some of the way that Africa was brutalized during slavery is that you simply took out the best members of the community. One could maybe say Africa has not been as strong and vital since colonialism as it had been for eternity, because of taking specifically the best members of society, largely the able-bodied and potent and virile men, but also the women too. So you need your strong and potent and viable women, but you also need the men. And I think that maybe the women might be more tolerable, and I think I would imagine that men and women assimilate in times of war, and also coalescing society. You could maybe say that men and women assimilate into different cultures differently than one another. Some have said that in American society, black females have generally a closer proximity to the higher degrees of power and affluence as a swath, as a cohort. They are more well suited and stronger suited and tolerated within dominant status quo society, generally speaking, than black males are. So that would be, but that doesn't mean that black males can't be equally and more so, and that black males can't always also thrive and benefit within the status quo as much so as a female. But I would think that it would be different. But simply, as our experience as black males in the U.S. is that a lot of the best of us, what's left of the best of us, and I'm not saying any of us are better or worse, but those of us who are healthy and of standing to impact the circumstance of ourselves and people like us and people different than us, and be impacted back. Those in what is left of a viable footing are yet compromised. So you see a young man slain in the street. Okay, so that's, some people would appreciate that as a statistic. You take a young man, healthy young man, vital young man, creative young man, an artist, a worker, anything, just simply a brilliant, beautiful black male, and he's also from a culture. So as beautiful as a black male is his experience and his rearing in a culture. He's been raised actually in the black culture, one of the beautiful, if not the beautiful cultures that the earth has seen, in America before, and in America and beyond. Black culture is beautiful and is beyond description. So you take a person of 18 and 20 years that's actually a benefactor of that culture and a part of that culture and all that comes with that, and then he's slain in the street at 18, 19, 20, 22, 24. That is atrocious in itself, because of what he could have done for himself and for culture and for learning and for life. But then you also took now whatever family he could have made. You could have had a daughter born from him that is the most beautiful female specimen that you never saw. You could have had a son that is the most funny, that is the most brilliant, that is the most kind, that is the most compassionate human being that you ever saw. And what they could have done from there. And then also what the presence of that family would have done for other children that would have grown up around that family and around those children, and how they would have benefited. So you create this sophisticated ripple that goes from this untimely death broader into the entire black experience, but to a degree, relatively speaking, and it's atrocious and it's heinous. So you didn't have to get any of you didn't have to round up his family, but you slayed him and his family never came here. So you actually did worse than rounding up his family because they never even got to be here to be rounded up. So that's a lot of the what I appreciate as genocide in American society. And the broader, the deeper aspect of that is simply that our image is assaulted in media and in politics and in education and in law and in medicine and on, our in local and abroad, in our own eyes and other eyes and back in our own eyes, and probably the more egregious is when it's in our own eyes, and where we can experience the brunt of racism and marginalization from people like us as soon, if not worse, or not a little bit less than people who don't look like us. And that's it's really egregious because you're being assaulted and undermined from all angles, all present, all 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 anticipated, present, and conceivable angles. You are being marginalized and assaulted from that. But the essence of that is the assaulting of your image, the mocking of your image. And that's what's tolerated for black males. And it's actually kind of sad that some of these other groups that don't tolerate that for themselves, maybe the deeper thing would be that when they wouldn't tolerate that for us, and then we would really be talking about rock and roll at that point. So all I meant to say is that with this video is that I appreciate that us as Africans we are one experience, and what affects one affects the bunch. But that's actually not different from any other ethnicity or human family, because I appreciate all human beings as emanating from Africa. But I know that other people have different thoughts about history and also the origin of human beings. And I know that all I know is that I don't have a lot of faith in hardly too much of any source of history that I've come across. And I've actually come across some sources that can speak intelligently to how compromised and diluted and watered down and falsifiable our notions of history are. The closer, the deeper, the only reliable history that I've come across would be probably my family. My father is a historian, but he also has living memory of a lot of the history and dynamics of African experience in the 20th century, the current century, and centuries past. My father has a grasp of that. And then I've met a handful of people at different times, obscure people in reality, and then maybe thought people on YouTube of different backgrounds that can have an interesting take and a reliable take on history. There's a few Native Americans that offer that. There's one channel called Navajo Elder Teachings, I think, on YouTube, and he makes available more insight into both the history and the experience, and also the understandings and the aesthetics of what's called the Navajo people, which I think Navajo might be a Spanish appropriation or maybe an bastardization of what that people are referred to. But I think, as this man has shared, that the original name had been Diné, and they are actually something of they're something of a mixed group historically in the region of the Southwest. It's actually the region that I grew up at, part of their region, part of the region that they've been present in historically. I grew up in part of that region, but not all of that region. And he says that they somewhat absorbed a lot of other groups, where it's a little bit arbitrary to look at them as one fixed ethnicity or heritage, simply because they were loving and they were like a safe haven and a refuge to different displaced Native American groups before. And I also don't mean to say Native American, because that can be distasteful to some people, as the word Hispanic can. But to different, and then you might say indigenous people, but some people might also not appreciate that word. So I don't want to use any arbitrary word, as our notions of history are limited and compromised to a large degree, but also because I haven't looked into it honestly to speak intelligently. But all I know is that from that man is that group, the Diné, is like they were loving, and they were a safe haven for different displaced Native American groups in the Americas. Before, during, and maybe after the colonial phase, or the teeth of the colonial phase. And you can maybe say we're still in the colonial phase. So that's one source of interesting and I think more so reliable history that's available on his channel. And then there's also a scholar named Taj Tariq Bey, Grand Sheikh Taj Tariq Bey, and he's actually a living descendant of Moorish heritage, and so he has a living oral history and inheritance of the actual descendants of the Moorish people who had a presence in Spain, Africa, and the Americas, and maybe India also. You can grasp some of that history listening to him, but all that you can, when you listen to him, you can appreciate that our understanding of our modern reality has been attended by and benefited by other cultures and civilizations, not only and not the least of which Native Americans, like your Mayans, the Incas, the Aztecs, and then maybe all of your Americas, and also like your Eastern Seaboard Native Americans, your Seminoles, your Iroquois. I think he calls them the Anansi, and I don't mean to sound like I'm a veteran or I'm of that history, but all I meant to say is that you had many different cultures and peoples. Some would say that those are not entirely different, the one from the other, in something they are to be respected as different, the one from the other. Tashreeq Bey says that these different human families yet have a deeper similarity, and that's betrayed in things like pyramids, because you have pyramids on all the continents. You have pyramids in Africa, no less, but you also have, I think you actually have more pyramids in the Americas and more actually in North America than it's usually recognized, but multiple pyramids in South America also, and you have pyramids in Europe, and you have pyramids in Asia, and you have pyramids underwater. And I would think maybe likely you have pyramids in Australia, but I can't confirm that. But that shows that there's actually a deeper history that is not it's not blatant or maybe to common knowledge, and some of that maybe by design, and it just shows that the people that are considered indigenous, Native American, African, European, Asian are not exactly what they're presented to us as in the standard history. And Tashreeq Bey also says that history was overlaid and overhauled at the beginning of the 20th century by some of your big barons. I'm not going to drop their names in this commentary, but some of their inheritors are still prominent leaders, both in our face and behind the scenes, and equally calling shots. But they had a history in overhauling the education in what's called education in the United States, and that it had actually been more potent before they did so. So if you were to take like exams from transitioning from late middle school into high school of like the late 18th century, as Tashreeq Bey did in one of his episodes, you can see that they were far more enlightened and advanced than you would ever think that someone in the 1800s could be. And that's because human beings have always been intelligent. Human beings have always done research. Human beings have always been organized. Human beings have always had cool ideas. Human beings have always had technology. But it is not in the interest of entitlement and privilege to have common people aware of who and what they actually are, because they wouldn't be as easily deprived if that were so. So part of that history is the overhaul of education in I think it's stemming around the New York City area in the early 20th century. But all I meant to say is that Tashreeq Bey is he's actually an influential person in certain bodies of people, but he's also an excellent, outstanding scholar. I more so am interested just in simply scholarship and truth more than any political allegiance. But I'm yet grateful for opportunities to learn original insight that is true to the human experience and what the human experience can be. So I salute all those people equally, but Tashreeq Bey is a source, is a somewhat verifiable. He has receipts for the type of things he said, the statements he makes, both in his own history and understanding. And as you engage with his material, you can see that there are traces of whatever you can. I think you can hide history, but I don't think you can destroy history. So you can destroy a lot of history, but you can't destroy history. So if you were to look at things like some of our etymology, if you were to actually look at the real words we're saying and where they come from, some of the slang too, the connotative linguistics that is in different culture, that's equally creative, and there are clues there too. But also the denotative, the actual strict etymology, which is yet also a function of connotation and metaphor and slang going way back, as it's been appreciated in a book about poetry that I have. I'm going to put the name of that book, that title, in this subheading so that I don't plagiarize that. but it's been said that metaphor and connotation is equally a engine of what would become denotative. So when you drive down the road and you see signs that show a symbol of something, that's more so connotative. When you see a description like a street name or a miles per hour sign in no uncertain terms like numbers and letters, that's denotative, and the etymology is appreciated as denotative. But it had yet, if we're being honest, maybe been a function of what is connotative in the first place. But the denotation within terms of etymology, it can't help but betray some of what the real history is, and that's why it has been stripped of a lot of the mass education, along with the with more congruent sources of history that would confound our modern paradigm and how we operate with one another in that false understanding of what reality is, because of the deprivation of the real history and the real understanding, and then also deprivation of some of the opportunities for achieving income, no less than removing the trades from the school, but also your books, from I think from going from the 50s beyond. They stripped a lot of the etymology. So this Tashriq Bey recommends something called Black's Law Dictionary, and if you were to look at that Black's Law Dictionary, you would see a deeper history in legal terms and words than is available in a lot of things. And I think that's some of what I've done these different videos talking about black, white, and colored, and how those words function and what they codify. And that would be available in like some of your law books when etymology was more so available. But all I meant to say is that the real history, it is still yet available and it still exists, and it's betrayed in some things like the etymology of our words, some of our scientific understanding, and even some of our religious allegory and scripture. There are deeper. Some people would say there's deeper messages in the text, but I think what's more so profound is a deeper history in the text, and what of it is allegory and what of it is fact, and what does the combination of that mean for both history and allegory, and how has that impacted us, and how has that been attended by us. So you actually can't. I think maybe life is a combination of fact and fiction, of thought and idea, of reality and thought, and so you actually maybe can't completely separate allegory and fact. I think that might be the deeper thing, is that you take a book of nonfiction and there may be something necessarily of allegory in there. You take something of allegory in there, and there may be something necessarily of fact in there, and we can maybe say that fact and history are not different. That is the same. You get into the deeper parts of history and you start learning the realer facts. That you listen to Tashriq Bey and he'll talk about how the moon, so the moon affects water, like the waves of the ocean, obviously the tide, but it also affects our body is more so water, and so it's also more so is the womb of a woman. And so the moon necessarily has a bearing on the womb of a woman, simply because it is more so water. We are water in the first place, and we are fashioned in water in the womb. And so the moon affects that. And then also there are things like there are different components like salt, particularly salt, that would be present in a womb. And the moon affects that, but also the position of the earth within the calendar cycle affects that. So it is significant when a person is conceived, and when and where they are born. It has a bearing on the planetary influences, and such also does our interfacing with money, what's called money and currency, and that also has a bearing on the opportunities for the conception of life and the bearing of life, and the viability of life is affected by attraction and repulsion, no less than the planetary motions of our local system, solar system, and broader, and no less than our currency. It impacts the opportunities to live and die. Currency does, what's called money does, and then that's understood, and you start to get little traces of that when you engage with content like that Navajo elder teaching or Tashriq Bey. And when you can connect these things that would seem very different, a Moorish man and a Native American elder, when you can connect them and what they're talking about, you actually get real science when you do that, like proper science, not this brutal stuff, but I mean real human understanding. And it goes deeper than deep, and it's beautiful. But it is necessary to have a facility, because we suffer from our ignorance. I think that's in the Bible. we suffer because we have not knowledge, I think it says. But if you have any oversight, you like you say dollar bill and you don't know you're saying a contradiction in oxymoron, you end up making blunders